Welcome to the second episode of my WWE Fantasy. If you have listened to the first part in its entirety, congratulations. In this part I will relate a few stories with characters you might be familiar with or perhaps not. I have changed the names and hopefully enough to disguise them. Remember, this is something out of my imagination. These events have not happened. About the time you think you have things figured out, I may throw a curve. Some of these events could cause embarrassment to the real people, and I have no intention to hurt anyone. At this point in time, they don't even know I exist. I begin with a scene in the Performance Center. There are a dozen men and a dozen women here for the tryout. A guy named Feudo is in charge today. He calls my name and I step forward. He explained the exercises I would need to perform. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to do what was required. A simple exercise of running the ropes would be out of the question. I would be tripping over my feet again and again. He said he was sorry, but if I couldn't do those exercises, WWE could not use me. I doubt any guy my age could do these things. I wasn't ready to quit so soon. I glanced at the ring and saw Pedro, a second-generation wrestler from Mexico. His father was Pedro Sr., a man about 5 feet tall, stocky, with a powerful build. Pedro Jr. was well over 6 feet tall and powerful. His mother was nearly 7 feet tall, so Pedro Jr. had some of his mother's height and his father's powerful build. His signature hold he called the Pedroizer. Hundreds of men had fallen prey to this powerful move. No one had been able to avoid that move. I had been studying that move for several years and thought I might see the one weakness that could resist that move. This could be my only chance to get into the WWE. I needed another miracle and prayed before I spoke. I asked Feudo if I could avoid the Pedroizer, would he bypass the exercise requirement. He took one look at me and looked at Pedro and smiled. He said if I could avoid the Pedroizer, I was in. I said it might take several attempts, and he said to take as many attempts as I wanted. A crowd quickly gathered. I stepped into the ring and shook hands with Pedro. He asked if I was sure I wanted to try this. I said yes, and I asked the most times he had applied the Pedroizer to an opponent in a single match. He said 6. I swallowed hard and said okay. I just stood there. Boom. One Pedroizer and I was lying flat on my back. I had seen in an old wrestling video the proper way to fall by putting my arms in a particular position to absorb some of the shock. That helped. I was in pain, but at least I was able to move. I slowly got up and said I'd like to try again. He said okay, if you're sure, and I said I was, and boom. I was on the mat again. More pain and more laughter. It took longer to get up this time. I said again, and the same results. The process continued till I had been Pedroized 6 times. By this time I was too weak to stand up the usual way. Had enough, he asked. Just one more time, I replied. As he prepared to zap me one more time, at the last second, I made my move. He was leaning just a little bit into the move, so I was able to catch him off balance. I avoided his move and was able to bring him down to the mat and cover him for the pin. The ref smacked the mat 3 times. I had not only avoided the Pedroizer, but I had been able to pin him as well. Everyone was shocked. Pedro was a good loser and laughed, and we shook hands again. Feudo said a promise is a promise. You're in. I left the facility and headed for my room. A hot shower, onto the bed, and I was asleep in seconds. The next morning Feudo gave me a tour. We passed a table of wrestlers I had seen in the ring often the past 5 years. We went through the usual introductions and I sat down. They were talking about all the struggles and trials they had to go through to make it to WWE. Then one of them asked how I got here. I simply replied I had made a crazy exercise video and posted it on YouTube. The laughing stopped, and everyone had a downcast expression on his face. Quietly they all stood up and walked away. After moving about 10 feet away, they started talking to each other. They couldn't understand how they had worked so hard to get there, and I just made a video. Ferretto and I started up the hall. Up ahead I saw the Brazilian birds of prey, Caracara and Osprey. They were about 6 feet tall, extremely thin, and having shiny black hair about to their waists. The story was they had grown up in the Amazon jungle. I remember from grade school social studies that Portuguese was the language of Brazil. I asked Ferretto if by chance he spoke that language and he said fluently. I asked for a nice phrase so I could make a good first impression. He gave me a phrase and I asked what it meant. He said you have a cute nose. I approached Caracara and spoke the phrase I had been told. She yelled something at me and started poking me in my chest. I am totally confused and turned to my friend. He smiled and told me that when a Brazilian woman likes you, she yells and then pokes your chest. That sounded crazy, but I just trusted him and asked how a guy is supposed to return the compliment. He said to pat her head. I'm ignorant of that culture, so I trust him and followed his instruction. Wham! I found myself lying on the floor. Caracara briskly walked away yelling something. I looked at my friend, and he just shrugged his shoulders saying she must be having a bad day. Osprey was still standing there looking very confused. Maybe I might fare better with her. My friend gave me a new phrase and without thinking I spoke that phrase. Within a second I felt Osprey's fist go deeply into my stomach. Then she walked away quickly. My friend was rolling with laughter on the floor and telling me he didn't know how to speak that language. I felt like the world was getting ready to crash in on me. The Brazilian birds of prey would tell their boyfriends who were two totally huge guys who could easily make mincemeat out of me, and the word would continue to up the line till the boss heard about this. My second day could be my last day. Then I saw a real Amazon with very long blonde hair and was around 6.5 feet tall. She had a very bouncy personality. Her name was Northern Lights and she came from Alaska. My friend confessed it was all his fault. He was trying to get back at me because our little bargain might get him in trouble with his boss. Northern Lights was a very good friend with the Brazilian birds of prey and could patch things up. One of the things I wanted to do was to teach the Brazilian birds of prey a submission hold I had developed from an amateur hold I learned from my high school wrestling coach. I gave it a new name from something I found on the web. Part of the problem would be a communication between them and me. The other problem was a lack of understanding of Brazilian social customs. Applying the hold involved bodily contact that might not be considered proper. I had to rely on Northern Lights to keep me out of trouble. I would apply the hold first on Caracara then on Osprey. I thought if they applied the hold on both of their opponents simultaneously it would make a great visual effect. I would tell Northern Lights what I was going to do so she could explain to Caracara what I was going to do so she would understand. Everyone was laughing because I was embarrassed. There was one point where I needed Osprey to move my arm to get it where it needed to be without touching an area where I shouldn't be touching. By this time Caracara and Osprey were talking excitably and I called to Northern Lights because I didn't know what was going on. I finally had the hold in place and told Caracara to see if she could escape. The next moment she did something very unexpected, and I quickly released her. By this time Northern Lights was laughing so hard she couldn't contain herself and left the room. Caracara and Osprey were laughing their heads off, and then they started speaking perfect English. The whole Amazon story was just a story. They had grown up in San Francisco, not the Brazilian jungle. We became very good friends. I told them I wanted them to use the hold before I used it, that way they could get credit for the hold. It would be a secret between the four of us. Later I found the two big boyfriends were actually their older brothers. Just another story. The rest of the guys behaved very properly toward the Brazilian birds of prey. Time passed. One evening the Brazilian birds of prey and I were out having coffee and conversation. Suddenly two big bruisers came along and started hassling us. The Brazilian birds of prey were experts in several forms of martial arts. Nevertheless it was one of those situations. It was kind of a guy thing. I was the only man of our group there, and I had been taught that a man is supposed to protect the lady who is with him. I had to get them to safety somehow. I told them they needed to leave and protect my unborn sons. They started moving away. Osprey said, "I'm not pregnant." Why did he say that? Are you pregnant? Kara replied, "Of course not, silly. He said that to give us a chance to get away to safety. We need to hurry back to get the guys here as soon as we can." They were nearly out of sight, and those men were not in a big hurry to tear me apart. As they stepped closer and closer, I thought there was no way I was going to survive. All my wrestling victories were through trickery. I prayed very quickly. This was not a time for a long flowery theological kind of prayer with all the these and thous. I needed help now. Suddenly I had another miracle. I had watched hundreds of Asian martial arts movies over the years. I started feeling this incredible power filling me from the top of my head and down to my toes. Those stored memories flowed from my head to my heart and then through the rest of my body. I became the most skilled martial artist ever. When those two men came within reach, my hands and feet started moving with blinding speed. Within seconds those two guys were lying unconscious, bloody, and bruised, and I had been untouched. The ladies arrived with help and were astonished. They all knew I'd be lying there probably dead from a terrible beating, but there I was still standing. They asked what happened. I told them and they all stood there in disbelief. I finally had time to catch my breath and asked myself if this situation was the reason for my journey to the WWE. Had I fulfilled my impossible dream, or perhaps there was another situation I would have to face till I achieved my destiny? What should I do next? Sounds like one of those cliffhanging endings to an old-fashioned movie serial. Now I must take a break from revealing the next part of my fantasy. The rest will be waiting for the reality to happen. The rest of the information I cannot reveal. These are my detailed plans for my future in WWE. They will simply sit on my computer till I am able to get them to that very special lady I had mentioned at some point. I've done about all I can to fulfill this fantasy. I might have to wait another year to receive that miracle. The older I get, the more miraculous the fulfillment will be. Recently I had what I call a conflict of conscience. I was watching a ladder match between two ladies. I saw so much pain and several serious injuries, and I decided I could no longer watch this kind of barbarous event. Much like a throwback to the events in an ancient Colosseum where people paid a fee to watch gladiators fight to the death or Christians being torn apart by wild beasts. The following week I started to watch the first match of a standard wrestling program. Neither woman was one of my favorites, so I did not care about who would win. Again I felt repulsed by the sight and fast-forwarded my recording to the next match. This time it involved men, and again I didn't care who won. I stopped the reading and have not looked at it since then. Checking on a wrestling news site, I saw information on the next two upcoming pay-per-view events. The first one contained a match involving a number of women from the three rosters. I made a posting on one of the Facebook boards basically explaining my dilemma, stating I would not be watching the event, but I would be praying there would not be any serious injuries. I understand the idea of planned outcomes, but I realize no matter how much time has been spent in preparation and rehearsing, things can happen that can produce terrible results. So many factors can be involved. One's timing can be off by a small amount, causing a disaster. Body positioning can be off, just a little far to the left or to the right, or too close or too far can mess the execution of a move. A little too much force could cause a problem. So many factors to deal with. One might wrestle too stiffly. The pressure to do whatever pleases the fans can have terrible consequences. Then my mind stops dealing with potential problems during the matches of this event along with the next event to my own situation. Here I am desiring a career at WWE where I could become a part of the problem. I doubt the decision makers would put me into one of those nasty types of matches that could result in a career-ending injury. Where could they find another guy my age who was stubborn or crazy enough to do what I was attempting to do? As I was praying about these upcoming matches, I wonder if even one of the participants would read my posting and would think about what I had said and create a conflict in that person's mind and cause just 1 second's delay or hesitation and have a terrible result. I would have to carry that on my conscience for a long time. I will have to pray throughout the day for everyone's safety, etc. I would check aside from time to time to find out what was happening, but I would not watch the actual matches. I am not sure what to do. Would I continue looking for a miracle and more direction, or just chalk it up to my imagination going wild? No, I am not concerned about going crazy. Just coping with a mixed up world,